Alright, in this tutorial we are going to take a look at working with text frames. I have some copy that we can put in here. So we have these two text frames already from last time. So we've got the title text frames. We can work on making these look more like the logo as well. And then I've got some frame for, or some copy for the other panels. So we've got the front panel tagline, some copy for the back panel, and then a quality assurance statement for one of the side panels. And then of course this side panel here is going to be the nutrition label, so we don't need really any copy there. Maybe we'll just duplicate the logo. So that's what we are going to do in this tutorial. Why don't we start with the text frames that we already have. So I'm going to move this out of the way for the moment. The text frames here look pretty good, but let's take a look at the logo and just do a quick comparison. So give me a second to pull up that logo. One thing I noticed when I was looking at the logo and comparing it to the text that we have, the font that they're using, which again I think is computer generated but then hand drawn in Illustrator, it uses this inverted apostrophe. So this is actually the left hand single quote from the font set. This is the right hand single quote. This is what we typically use for an apostrophe, so we'd say this is stylized. It's not an actual correct punctuation mark to use, but we're going to use it anyway since that's what they used in the logo. And they'll give us a good chance to practice inserting glyphs, which is, we're going to do it here, and we'll do it with some of the copy that we have as well. So why don't we go ahead and try and fix that first. So I was noticing when you look at the stroke of these cursive letters, it's not matching up quite like we would think it would, and that's because this apostrophe is bumping the S out further to the right, so it's taking up a little bit of space here, vertical space. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at the actual frame. So I just double clicked into that. Here's the S, and then if we go past the S, here's the K, but there's one character in the middle. There we go. That's the apostrophe. So that's the character that we need to change. Now what we could do is I could just delete, oops, I deleted the S by accident. Let me put that back in. Get rid of the apostrophe. I could just insert the correct glyph, and I'm going to go to Insert Glyph, and then I want to bring up the full character palette. These are just characters that I took from other fonts as I was working on other projects, but I want the whole character palette. Click that button and I'll drag it over so you can see. So here it looks like is our inverted apostrophe. This is the left hand single quote. So I'm going to insert that. I just double clicked it to put it into the glyphs to insert, and then you hit insert to put it into your copy. And there we go. We have it, but now look what happened. Unfortunately, it's taking up even more space than the right hand single quote or the apostrophe. So we're going to probably take this out of this frame. Oops, I need to close the character palette first. Let's take this out of the frame. I'm just going to cut it. And there we go. That K and S, the stroke looks a lot more natural that way. And why don't we make a new text frame using the controls here, and then I'll go Control V to paste. So there's our inverted apostrophe. Now I'm going to reduce the size of this frame just a little bit, and then we can sort of maneuver it into position using the directional arrows on the keyboard. And we can bring up the logo to compare the positioning. That looks about right. It looks like it's right off up and to the right of this stroke. We'll know the positioning a little bit better once we add the text outline. In fact, why don't we add the text outline right now, since we're on that subject. So I'm going to show you, I'll show you two ways to edit text in Scribus. One is using the story editor. So that's when you hit Control T on your keyboard, and that is going to let you perform edits using this dialog. But the one thing I'll say about using this, it has some advantages if you're using styles, and it's a little bit faster to apply styles to longer blocks of copy, but we don't have very much copy in this project since it's a box. So what this doesn't help you do is when you make a change, like let's see, I'll put the text outline on here. I've made a change and the text has changed, but it doesn't update the frame. You have to do that manually by clicking on this button, or you have to get Control U on your keyboard, and then it'll update the frame. That can be a little tricky to work with because you can't see the changes in real time, and it can also waste a little bit of your time. So, and then when you're done, you have to click this button to update and exit. It's a little cumbersome to deal with doing that every time you make a change. So the way that I usually edit text frames is I click on them and then I go to properties, and if you don't have properties open, it's just F2 on the keyboard. Then you can go to the text tab in properties, and that'll let you do almost everything that you can do in the story editor, if not everything that you can do in the story editor. And it lets you work with text frames that have less text in them, and you can see the effects in real time. So here, I'll turn on text outline, and then why don't we change the color of the outline stroke to yellow text outline. We already picked that out. A little bit faster, right? A little bit easier to work with. So let's go ahead and increase the size of that stroke width, because I notice it's much larger, much thicker in the logo here. If we compare them side by side, you can see that the stroke width and the outline stroke width are a lot closer in size to each other than this. So the way they control that in Scribus is you hold the left mouse button down when you're on an outline, and then you can define a line width here. And why don't we make it 2%? Yeah, maybe even 3% is appropriate given the comparison with the logo. Let's take a look. Yeah, some of these strokes look a little too thin, like the actual stroke of the R looks a little too thin for my liking. So maybe we'll come down to, how about 2.5? Click on that, and then I'll go 2.5. Yeah, that looks a little bit better. You don't have the text outline so thick that the stroke of the actual letter form attenuates to nothing. You can still see the actual letter form stroke here. So that's what we'll go with, 2.5. Oh, and we got to get 2.5 text outline here too. Oh, and then we need to change the color too. Change it to our yellow color that we picked for text outline. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. We can compare it with the logo. It looks like the apostrophe is touching, and it's actually touching here too, although maybe we want to have it a little more conjoined with the other text frame. Okay, let's zoom back out. Oops. Okay, so there we go. We've got our text outline. I can fix this one later, not on camera. Why don't we start putting in our other copy? So I've got right here the back panel copy. That's our biggest text block. So why don't we start with that? I'm going to copy the text out of the text editor, and then I'm going to make a new text frame. I'll put it, oops, my mouse slipped when I was making that. Let me make that a little bit bigger. It's no big deal if you paste the text in and the text frame is too small. Here, I'll show you what happens. Make it much smaller. What you'll see is this error. So you'll get this little red box in the bottom right-hand corner. That's going to tell you that the text that you put into the frame is too much to fit in the frame size that you have. Text frames will fill left to right and then top to bottom. So however wide you make the text frame, it's going to fill the copy, and then it'll just keep adding it on the bottom. You can add padding too on the frame if you need that as well. But if your text frame is too short and there's not enough room for that copy, it'll give you this error, and you'll have to resolve that when you're exporting. It'll give you an error on the export, and it'll say, hey, some of your text is outside of the frame. Let's go ahead and edit this text. So I was trying to think of a font family that would go well with this scripty font that the logo uses, and I came up with Poirot 1. Let me go ahead and get back to the text tab, and we can change the font. Let me just skip down to it. If you start typing, if you start typing the font, when you have the drop down open, it'll skip to that font. So Poirot 1 is a Google font. I'm going to make it bigger. Make the text size, I don't know, 20. We'll start with 22. You'll notice when you increase the text size that the lines are going to start running into each other because you manually set leading in Scribus. This isn't like when you're using a word processing program like Microsoft Word or Google Docs. They'll automatically adjust the leading as you increase the font size. Here they call it line spacing, but line spacing and leading are the same thing. That's the thing that your graphic design ruler lets you measure with those vertical bands down the middle of the ruler. So a good rule of thumb is if you have, say, 22-point font, you add 2 point to the line spacing to get the line spacing value. So we'd go up to 24. And that looks pretty good, actually, although I think this text is maybe a little bit too large. We probably want to come down to like maybe 18 and then 20. And you could actually, maybe we'll do 22. It all depends really how much you want the line spaced out. If you go too high on the leading, it starts to look like you're trying to take up more space than the text actually occupies. People will do that sometimes on resumes when they're designing them for the first time. They'll leave way too much space between the lines, and it definitely starts to look to your eye like you're attempting to make up for the fact that you don't have enough copy to fill up the space. So you can go too far with the leading, but if you're trying to just guess from the font size that you've got, just try adding 2 or 4 to that. And we're actually going to read Bringhurst's description of how to go through the process of determining leading. There are certain ratios of sizes in terms of font and leading that typesetters usually go to, and they sort of stay in that lane of decisions. And you can extrapolate it out to many different font sizes. It all has to do with kind of how the fonts and font sizes were sized in the early days of letterpress printing. So we've got one text frame here. Let's get the tagline text. I'm going to copy it from my text editor off the screen and then just put a new text frame in. And I'll paste it. And then why don't we get one of the quality assurance statements as well. Actually, you know what I'm going to do here? I'm going to put in the rest of the text frames, and I'm going to go to time lapse so you don't have to sit here and watch me put them all in, because it'll take me a minute or two. Okay, now I've got all my copy put into the canvas, so I'm going to start to change the font here. And I was thinking when I was looking at this that we probably want to only include one more font. We already have the script font, and then we're using Poirot. This is not probably a suitable font, though, for this sort of generic quality assurance copy. We just probably want something simple, like a simple sans serif. We don't need anything flashy for this. But because we have 1, 2, 3 or 4 different levels of copy, and we don't want to have to deal with a bunch of different types of fonts, we probably want to pick a font that has a lot of different formatting options. So that's where we want to go with font maybe like, I was thinking, Poppins, which is also a Google font. better than Arial. It's got a few more distinct features than Arial. I mean, you wouldn't want to send a design to a client that used just plain old Arial or any sort of default font. They'd probably be a little upset with you if they were paying for that. Let's change all of these to Poppins. Oops. There we go. And you know what, we'll just do one more, and the rest I can fix off camera. So let me go to that one. Okay. So when you look at Poppins here, Poppins has a lot of different choices for the width of the stroke. Black is the thickest stroke, right? And I can make that a little bigger so maybe it's a little easier to see. It actually looks pretty good now that I'm looking at it. Maybe adjust the line spacing. But black is the thickest stroke typically, and then you've got options that get lighter from there. So you've got semi-bold or demi-bold, medium, thin, light, extra bold is also in there. There's a lot of different stroke widths. And then you've got italic options for all of those as well. So if we wanted, say, something like semi-bold italic, that has a very modern look to it. It may not be the most appropriate choice for this. But the point is, you get options. I think probably italic would look good for a phone number. This isn't true italic, it's just oblique, but it's definitely going to work for this copy that doesn't really have any special attributes to it. We don't need to make it look especially impressive. Oh, it looks like there's one more special character that we are leaving out, isn't there? You would never want to send this to a client as is. Trademark is actually a character in most fonts, but before you start working with a font, if you have characters that you know you need, it's a good idea to use that Wakami Fondue site. I'll pull it up here to check and make sure that you've got the character that you need. Let me go ahead and pull up the font file here. So we're using Poret 1. I'm going to drop the TTF file in here. Okay, so let's scroll down. You can see all of the characters that are on the top of the keyboard typically come first. Then you have all of the Latin letters, and then you typically cycle through some other stuff. Like here you've got curly braces, the pilcrow. Here's our copyright symbol and our restricted symbol or registered trademark symbol. And then you get characters that are used mostly in other languages, although, again, it's kind of something that you have to think about when you're designing. If you're going to even typeset something in English, but you need to use words from a foreign language that use these characters that we don't typically use, like characters with diacritics or diaeresis, like an umlaut here, you need to be able to reproduce those faithfully. You cannot use a font set that doesn't have those characters in it, because what you will end up with are Unicode characters, and those look very generic. They don't actually end up matching the characters that the rest of the font has in them. Let's see, I'm pretty sure we've got trademark in here though. Yep, it's down here all the way at the bottom, but we do have the registered trademark icon or glyph in this font set. So that's a good thing. Let's go ahead and insert that into our project. Let me get this clutter out of the way. Okay, so let's go back to Insert, Glyph. I'll bring up the character palette again, and it was all the way at the bottom, I believe. There it is. Let me double click to put it in the text to insert, and then I'll clear that out and close it. Okay, that looks normal, right? This looks like something you'd see in a document that was typesetted well. This does not, and this would be totally unacceptable to use in a project. Imagine, I think Williams uses the example, somebody's paying you millions of dollars to, well, not millions, thousands of dollars to put up a billboard, and they're going to spend millions to reproduce it all over the country. and you hand them something like this with the wrong character or a placeholder for a missing character, it's not really acceptable, especially if you're on a paying basis with a client. So we can get rid of that. And then really all we need to do, I think, for these text frames is I need to go through and change them all to the fonts that we selected. And I can do that off camera. We're going to change the size of the text and the stroke width and some of maybe the line spacing as well once we work on placing all of the elements into a grid on the page. So we're just really setting the stage for the final job, which is to actually start laying out the page into a grid or into a design, and then actually adjusting the text and image to fit the design that we're going for, and that's what we're going to work on in the next tutorial. So that is the end of this tutorial.